She called the cops because I locked my own gate from the inside, and in her twisted version of reality, a man enjoying a quiet Saturday in his own backyard was a criminal act in progress. There she was standing just outside my fence line, phone pressed to her ear, pacing back and forth with that frantic, self-righteous energy of someone who just caught a bank robber, shouting into the receiver that, end quote, he's barricaded himself inside the community aquatic center, end quote. Except it wasn't her pool, it wasn't the community's property, and it sure as hell wasn't Oppo's. An aquatic center. It was mine, every single tile, every drop of chlorinated water, and every inch of the cedar. Decking my father and I had laid down with our own hands long before our neighborhood even had a name, let alone a homeowners association. But logic is a foreign language to people like Margaret Vance, a woman who decided the moment she was elected HOA president that my deed was just a suggestion and her clipboard was a scepter. By the time the sheriff's cruiser pulled up, she was waving her stack of, end quote, violation notices, end quote, like a holy relic, screaming about safety hazards and neighborhood aesthetics. But I didn't in Oppo's. I didn't in Oppo's. Argue. I just sat there on my lounge chair with a folder of original land surveys and waited for the moment she'd realize her authority stopped exactly where my grasp began. Because sometimes the law doesn't end Oppo's. Need to shout to win a fight. It just needs to stand its ground. While the neighborhood bullies self-destructs in front of an audience. My name is Elias Thorne, and I'm the kind of guy who likes his hedges trimmed, his taxes paid, and his business kept to himself. But I've lived in this valley long enough to know that a man's home is his castle until someone decides they want to be the queen of the moat. This pool behind my house, ISN and Oppo's. Just a place to swim. It's a piece of history, a project my dad started back in the late 70s when this whole area was nothing but oak trees and dirt roads. And he used to tell me that water and boundaries have a lot in common, because if you don an Oppo's, respect them, they'll eventually remind you why you should have. I grew up with the smell of cedar and PVC glue, watching him measure twice and cut once, teaching me that stewardship of the land is a quiet, heavy responsibility, and for decades, that's exactly what it was, until the developers moved in, the luxury townhomes went up, and the, end quote, Willow Creek Estates, end quote. HOA was born with Margaret Vance at the helm. She arrived like a cold front, all polished smiles and rehearsed, end quote, neighborly, end quote, concerned, but she was a realtor by trade, which meant she saw the world through the lens of curb appeal and property value. And to her, my private, custom-built oasis was an eyesore simply because it didn't end Oppo's. Belonged to her, to control. The first time she cornered me, she was wearing a pastel blazer and carrying a clipboard that looked like it had been surgically attached to her arm, and she told me with a straight face that, end quote, several residents were under the impression that the pool area was a shared amenity included in their dues, end quote. I remember looking at her, then back at my house, then back at her, trying to figure out if she was joking, but her eyes were like two pieces of flint, hard and cold. I told her as politely as I could that it's on my deed, it's privately insured, and it's not an amenity, it's my backyard, but she just tapped her pen against her chin and said, end quote, we'll see about that, end quote, in a tone that made my hair stand on end. She started including photos of my pool in the community newsletter, calling it a, end quote, signature feature of Willow Creek, end quote. And when I asked her to stop, she just smiled that thin, bloodless smile and talk about, end quote, aesthetic cohesion, end quote, and, end quote, the shared vision of the neighborhood, end quote. It was surgical, the way she did it, never a direct attack at first, just a slow, steady erosion of the truth until my neighbors, people I'd known for years, started looking at me like I was hoarding a public resource. Then came a night the teenagers climbed the fence, and that was the moment the peace officially died, because finding 3 dripping wet kids laughing in your backyard at 2 in the morning, ISN and Oppo's. Just a nuisance. It's a lawsuit waiting to happen. They told me they thought it was the, end quote, community club pool, end quote, because that's what the HOA Facebook page said, and right then and there I knew the, end quote, neighborly, end quote, approach was over. I installed a heavy-duty, weather-sealed brass padlock on the gate the very next morning. Not because I wanted to be a jerk, but because my father's voice was ringing in my head about protecting people from their own stupidity. I set the code, snapped it shut, and felt a brief, flickering moment of relief. But that relief lasted exactly 48 hours before my inbox was flooded with, end quote, urgent notices of noncompliance, end quote. Margaret claimed I was obstructing a, end quote, shared access point, end quote, and creating a, end quote, life safety hazard, end quote, by locking a gate that had been there for 40 years. And when I replied with a scanned copy of my 1978 land survey, she didn't end oppose. T apologize, she doubled down, issuing daily fines of $200 and posting a public notice on the community board about, end quote, resident resistance to safety protocols, end quote. It was a psychological war of attrition, and if I hadn't end oppose, T spent my life working as a structural engineer, I might have cracked under the pressure, but engineers are trained to look for the stress points in a system, and Margaret Vance was a system held together by nothing but bluff and bluster. I started my own folder, end quote, binder a, end quote, and I documented every single interaction, every fine, every passive-aggressive email, and every time I saw her car idling at the end of my driveway. I caught her on my security cameras snapping photos of my fence. I saw her pointing out my property to contractors, and then the drones started appearing, little buzzing insects hovering over my water, marking coordinates like they were preparing for an invasion. The neighborhood gossip mill was turning me into a villain, with people whispering that I was, end quote, diverting water, end quote, or, end quote, hiding code violations, end quote. And I realized that in a community like ours, fear travels a lot faster than the truth, and Margaret was the one holding the megaphone. But here's the thing about people who are obsessed with control. They eventually get sloppy because they start believing their own hype, and Margaret's biggest mistake was thinking I was just a stubborn old man who didn't oppose. T know how to play the game. I hired a property rights attorney named Julian Thorne. No relation, but he had a shark-like instinct for HOA overreach, and he told me to, end quote, let her keep digging the hole, end quote. So I did. I watched her fines pile up to over $5,000. I watched her schedule a, end quote, community inspection, end quote, with a local building official, and I watched her gather the neighbors on the sidewalk for what she thought was going to be my public execution. She'd invited the local news blog. She'd called the sheriff's office to, end quote, keep the peace, end quote, and she stood there in her powder blue suit, telling the crowd that, end quote, today we reclaim the integrity of Willow Creek, end quote. When the sheriff arrived, a tall, no-nonsense guy named Miller who looked like he'd seen every flavor of neighborly insanity, Margaret practically tripped over herself to tell him how I was, end quote, unlawfully barricading community assets, end quote. I didn't oppose. T say a word. I just stood by my gate, holding my binder, and waited for the county inspector to finish his walkthrough of the fence line. The inspector, a guy who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, looked at the maps, looked at my deed, and then looked at Margaret with a face that was pure, unadulterated pity. He told her right there, in front of the cameras and the coffee-clutching neighbors, that the pool, the deck, and even the drainage ditch she'd been trying to claim were private property, documented and sealed decades before the HOA was even a glimmer in a developer's eye. But the real kicker, the moment the air truly left the room, was when Julian, my lawyer, stepped forward with the results of a subterranean survey we'd done. It turns out that a year prior, Margaret had authorized the HOA to quietly reroute the entire cul-de-sac storm runoff into an old waterline trench that ran directly into my property, without a permit, without an easement, and without telling me. They were using my private land as a free sewage and drainage solution to save the HOA budget a few $1,000s. And if that pipe had burst, I would have been the one on the hook for the damage. The silence that fell over that sidewalk was so heavy you could have anchored ship with it. And watching the color drain out of Margaret's face as the sheriff realized he was being used as a pawn in a criminal trespassing and infrastructure tampering case was the most satisfying thing I've ever experienced. Sheriff Miller didn't oppose. He arrested me for locking my gate. Instead, he turned to Margaret and told her, end quote, mind oppose. You're skating dangerously close to a harassment charge, and if I were you, I'd stop talking and start looking for a lawyer of your own, end quote. The aftermath was a slow-motion car wreck for the Willow Creek Board because once the neighbors realized their dues had been spent on illegal pipe laying and a personal vendetta, the end quote, aesthetic cohesion, end quote, Margaret had preached about vanished overnight. She resigned within the week, put her house on the market a month later, And the new board, the one made of actual humans who just want to live their lives, voided every single fine and even had to pay me a hefty settlement to avoid a massive lawsuit over the drainage tampering. Now, the neighborhood is quiet again, the way it's supposed to be, and I still have that brass lock on my gate, but it doesn't end oppos to feel like a weapon anymore. It feels like a boundary that everyone finally respects. I sit out there in the evenings now, watching the sun dip below the oaks, and I think about how many people are living under the thumb of Margaret right now, wondering if they should just give in to the pressure. I'm curious, though, have you ever had a neighbor or an HOA try to tell you that your own property didn't end oppos to belong to you, or have you ever seen community leader use their power to settle a personal grudge? It makes you wonder if these organizations are actually there to protect our home values, or if they're just playgrounds for people who never got over being the hallway monitor in middle school. Some people tell me I should have just let them use the pool and avoided the drama. That life is too short for, paperwork wars, but I think life is too short to let someone else draw the lines on your own map. Was I being the, neighborhood grouch, or was I just a man protecting his father's legacy from a woman who didn't end oppos to know where her yard ended? Tell me what you think in the comments, because in a world where everyone wants a piece of what you've built, sometimes a heavy brass lock is the only thing that keeps the peace.